Now, I'm thrilled to introduce our host, Dr. James Montgomery, a fellow DePaul professor with a wealth of knowledge in environmental science and studies. He will discuss his What's in Your Soil project, as well as provide educational information on soil-led contamination and how to mitigate its impact. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Montgomery.
Thanks, Jasmine, and welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and share quite a bit about a project that I've been working on with students for over a dozen years now. And I've kind of given it the name of Dishing the Dirt on Chicago's Dirty Dirt. Little bit about my background. I've been at DePaul now 30 years, and I am both a geologist by academic training as well as a soil scientist. And I teach a variety of courses in the Department of Environmental Science and Studies, including a course in environmental soil science. So without further ado, I want you to look at this quote. We are all temporarily not soil. And what does that mean? Well, if you're a spiritual person, that might have quite a bit of significance. You know, dust from dust. We come from dust, we return to dust. And when you look at the major religions, they all have creation stories that involve soil, dust, dirt, and mud. This phrase was coined by a very famous soil scientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. Francis Hole. We are all temporarily not soil. And I happen to think the soil is the most important natural resource that we interact with. So here's our society on the left. All of us are guilty of this. We're trotting down the street. We're looking at our cell phone. And in many respects, we've become disconnected from nature, particularly urban nature. And we're walking across sidewalks and paved streets that are or have been built on soil, probably not thinking about what is below that pavement or that sidewalk. But ask yourself this question. How many of you out there can relate to the picture on the right? When you were a child, getting muddy and dirty was fun. Tromping around was fun, and your parents may have just been left gasping, oh no, you're all dirty, go in and take a shower, take a bath, get the dirt off. And you know, our ancestors would not recognize the sterile humans that we have become. And so I'm like these little kids. I'm still a little kid when it comes to soil. I absolutely love it. I like to play in it with my students, and I have learned a lot from this process. And even our childhood icons. Here we go, Winnie the Pooh. You may have read the book, The Great Huffalump Hunt. And here's Pooh looking down a hole, and poor Piglet is down there looking into the honey pot. But look what's around that hole. You see some roots. You see these little burrows with worms, these major engineers in the soil. You see a rabbit. I don't know if it's the rabbit, but a rabbit that's living in a burrow. All of these things are important to us because from death in the soil comes life. So what is soil? Well, there's a lot of definitions of soil, and we're actually beginning to question now whether other planets can have soil. But it's a natural body. It's got a lot of mineral material, about 45%, 25% of it is water, 25% is air in an ideal soil, and 5% is organic matter. You would know that probably as compost. But when you look at what's living in the soil, that to me is what is so fascinating. Besides roots, bacteria, fungi, all kinds of critters, small critters, microscopic critters. viruses and bacteria, all the way up to medium-sized critters, insects, earthworms, grubs, maggots, and even larger animals like moles and groundhogs and things like that, things that burrow in the soil. Well, if we look at what's in a healthy soil, every 1% increase in organic matter can store an additional 25,000 gallons of available water in the soil per acre. A teaspoon of soil. Go to your kitchen and pull out your measuring spoons. Look at a teaspoon. A teaspoon of healthy soil may have anywhere from 100 million to 1 billion individual bacteria. Earthworms, these major engineers, and by the way, earthworms around this area are actually invasive. They came in after the last glaciation. They can eat up to 2 tons of dry matter per acre of soil per year, and they mix it into the soil. And that's really important for the release of nutrients, but also giving the soil good porosity, good permeability. If we looked at all the soil microbes in an acre foot, so imagine an acre of soil 1 foot deep, the total biomass would be more than the weight of 2 cows. So what does it take then to feed 9 billion people in a world that is growing increasingly urbanized? Where is our food going to come from? And the exciting thing is, Illinois has a state bird. It's the northern cardinal. We also have a state soil. It's the drummer silt loam series. This is a grassland. If you were here 150 years ago, before Chicago as we know it existed, these tall grass prairies would have sent root systems down as deep as 20 feet. And when those roots decomposed, they left behind a very dark and deep soil that was extremely agriculturally productive. But there are some rules. Soil is not dirt. Dirt is dead. Soil is living. And soil provides us with a lot of valuable ecosystem services, some of which you can see here. So construction materials. Think about Chicago. We're surrounded by gravel pits thanks to the glaciers that ground up rock. And then when the glaciers melted and retreated, left us with this kind of mantle of sand and silt and clay and gravel, which we can excavate for construction. We're very lucky. But soil is also has a lot of cultural meaning, as I mentioned, the creation stories. And they're also a repository for cultural artifacts. So archaeologists have to know something about soil and sediment. Again, from death comes life, nutrient cycling. They are a habitat, for a variety of organisms. Pharmaceuticals and variety of genetic resources. So things like streptomycin, penicillin were cultivated from bacteria from the soil. And they help us to regulate water and air, purify them both, and they provide food and fiber. There isn't anything that we use, natural materials, that did not come in some way from the soil. So now I want to kind of switch gears and talk about soil health. Now, this is a bit of a controversial topic because what does it mean? Well, we can relate that to human health. What do we mean by human health? You may think it's going to the doctor for a checkup. But if you talk to the fine folks in our Department of Health Science, they will tell you that human health comprises a lot more than just your physical health, your mental health. It's looking at things like social determinants of health. But in soil health, we have 3 main spheres: physical health, chemical health, and biological health. And if you look at the Venn diagram in the center, that comprises soil health. So I measure certain aspects of physical health, some of which you see here. I'm not going to get into the weeds on that. I measure some of the aspects of chemical health. Reaction just refers to the pH of the soil. Nutrient reserves are things like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. And then biological health, I don't do much with that, but things like looking at biodiversity, soil organic carbon pool, that's really important these days with climate change because soils are not only sinks for carbon, but there also can be sources of carbon. But we live in a unique environment in Chicago. We have different kinds of soils than what you're going to find downstate in the agricultural belt. And these are what we call anthropogenic soils, okay? And I like this quote from Dr. Dan Richter. He's a soil scientist at Duke University. It's quite humbling to realize that humans today are the planet's major geomorphic agent, sculpting the Earth's landscape at a rapidly increasing rate. So geomorphology is a study of how landforms are created. And if you'll notice something about Chicago, it's really, really flat. And that's because the glaciers that came through planed off all the material, and then when they melted, left behind this large, extensive apron of sediment. So glaciers are a major geomorphic agent, but so are humans. And this quarter, I'm teaching a focal point course for freshmen, and it's called Soils, Civilization, and Human Health. And we're using this book by David Montgomery, no relation. He is a geologist and a geomorphologist at the University of Washington in Seattle, and he wrote many years ago this book called Dirt. And when you look at this book, you begin to see just how important soils were in the rise of ancient civilizations, whether you're talking Mesopotamia, Greeks, the Romans, the Phoenicians, the Mayans, the Incas, in Judea, in Israel, and Palestine, and why those civilizations went into demise. And a major factor, not the only one, was they depleted their soil of nutrients and it either washed or blew away. And we have that history here in the United States with the American Dust Bowl in the 1930s. And that's going to be a theme of this course in a couple of weeks. It's a wonderful book. I definitely suggest that you check it out. So a little bit more about what anthropogenic soils are. They're soils that have been influenced, modified, or created by human activity, in contrast to soils formed by more natural processes. And this is from my pal, Jeff Howard. He's a geologist and soils guy at Wayne State University in Detroit. And he wrote the book on anthropogenic soils. Now, look at the soil on the right. This is called the LaGuardia soil. It is in New York City. And it's named for a former New York mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia. What a thing to have named after you. This is a soil that was built in a garbage dump. And all that debris you see there are things like bottles and plastic and metal. You can see, look at that. There's a car chassis in the background. All that stuff gets buried in a landfill. And we have a lot of landfills around Chicago, which have some really interesting urban soils. We have what we call in Chicago an anthroscape, and I imagine these photos look familiar. The one in the top left is showing you Grant Park looking north, okay? The roadway to the right, not sure if you can see this cursor or not, is Michigan Avenue. Everything east of Michigan Avenue is all lake fill material, including debris from the Great Fire of 1871. At one time, the shoreline of Lake Michigan lapped up against Michigan Avenue. To the right, you see Millennium Park, Pritzker Pavilion, the largest green roof. And the lower left, that is the old US Steel Southworks plant. That's 600 acres of lake fill, predominantly steel slag, that they're still trying to figure out what to do with this site, but it is now called Steelworkers Park. I take my freshman students and discover Chicago down there. It's a really nice place. You get a good view. It's the southernmost portion of the Chicago lakefront, okay? And on the right, you see the Lincoln Park Lagoon. So all of this is kind of artificial. These are anthropic or anthropogenic soils. So let's switch gears and talk about lead. Oh boy. We've known about the human health impacts of lead since the Romans, but the Romans documented cases of lead poisoning because they were drinking their wine in lead goblets. There is no safe level of lead in the environment. Okay, that is from the Centers for Disease Control. And it is often referred to as a silent pediatric epidemic. Now, the US EPA sets a standard for lead in soil in children's play lots. And I put that in quotes because what's a play lot? At one time, my backyard was a play lot for my 3 kids. It's 400 parts per million. But that's not a health-based standard. Most recently, the Centers for Disease Control revised the blood lead reference level for children, okay, 6 months to about 6 years, early elementary age, down to 3.5 micrograms per deciliter of whole blood. So you have a young child, a toddler, when they go to school, you may have to produce the results of a lead test. And finally, which I will allude to in a little bit, lead contamination is a major environmental justice issue throughout the United States and certainly here in Chicago. So let's talk about lead in the environment. This is a home that we sampled the soil from as part of the What's in Your Soil project, and I'll get to the genesis of that project a few slides down the road. This house was painted with lead-based paint, which is a major source of lead in the environment. And that arrow is pointing to that gray stuff is that flaking lead paint that's falling down and it's accumulating at the base of that back wall there. And the fellow that, this is from Edgewater, okay? And the fellow that owns it, the bushes you see are raspberries and strawberries. And when we measured the lead, keep in mind, keep the number 400 in mind. This was almost 3,000 parts per million of total lead in the soil. But probably most of the lead that we see around Chicago is coming from the period of leaded gasoline. And we phased out leaded gasoline in the mid to late 1970s, okay? But we still have a legacy footprint of it. It's found in dust. So if you have an older home, you may have interior walls that were painted with lead. You know, the high rises, the Chicago Housing Authority high rises, the interiors were painted with lead paint. The lead would begin to chip off and the children would pull it off and eat it because it had a sweet taste like candy. But you know, if you have small kids, that all little kids go through a hand to mouth phase. And so if you have a lot of dust that's accumulated in your windowsills and on your floors, and your child is playing on the floor and they're putting a toy in their mouth, they may be ingesting or inhaling lead dust. Soil is a major component of lead, particularly in urban areas. We find it in pesticides, cigarette. I mean, folks, I could give you an hour talk on all of the things that lead is found in. I belong to a listserv called LeadNet. There isn't a week that goes by when someone isn't posting another thing in which they have found lead. So it is ubiquitous. We see it everywhere on our globe. It is at the North Pole in the ice, the South Pole, and the Greenland ice sheet. So let's talk about environmental justice. Here you see a map of the city of Chicago, and you can see that at this point in time, 3.5% of Chicago children under 3 had elevated blood lead levels, which means that they were above 3.5 micrograms per liter. Look at the neighborhoods where this occurs. Now look at the right. This is food deserts. Look at the overlap there. That's not terribly surprising. There is some overlap. And if we look at this hardship index, which was created at WIYS, they've created a hardship index that is basically kind of the amalgam, if you will, of 6 variables: unemployment over the age of 16, education over 25 years of age without a high school diploma, per capita income, poverty, households below the poverty level, crowded housing, housing units with more than 1 person per room, and dependency, the population under 18 or over 64 years of age. It's not terribly surprising to see that the reddest areas here, so the higher the numbers, the greater the hardship, correspond with areas where there is elevated blood lead level, high levels of lead in the soil, and food deserts. So A little over a year ago, a professor at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, Andrew Marginot, and his grad student, George Watson, came up and they did a big survey of lead and soil in the city of Chicago. And they added their data to a map called Map My Environment, which was created down at Indiana University, Purdue University, by Dr. Gabriel Filippelli. And all I want you to see here is all of these were samples collected by the graduate student, George Watson. And these are the concentrations. Remember the number 400. So you can kind of see that in the city and even some of the suburbs, we still have really high lead. So lead in the home. If you have a home built before 1978 and you have wood frame construction, so exterior wood walls, it may have been painted at one point with lead paint. If it's been painted since that time, they've phased out lead, adding lead to paint. Lead provided the paint some flexibility, which is good for the climate that we have here, okay? But that lead will chip off over time and it will fall. And actually, other cities where they have sampled the soil right against the wall of the home, underneath the eave, the eave of the roof, is where they often find the highest lead, because that's where the lead paint accumulates. Children are at the greatest risk, okay? And the main exposure actually is through soil and dust, okay? So it can blow in through your windows, comes in through your doors. How does it get in? Tracks in on your shoes, on your clothes. If you got a hairy pet, it's in their fur. You know, they come in and what do? They shake and they, get rid of all the dander and the dead hair, but they're also getting rid of lead dust that they've picked up along the way, okay? So lead dust levels have been directly correlated with blood lead levels, okay? So what I want to show you here is you can see that when we look at the body burden in the sources, dust and soil are well over 50% of the contribution into the human body, okay? Now, we've gotten a lot of traction in the press in Chicago about lead pipes, and I'll talk about those in a little bit, okay? So how does lead affect children's health? Well, take a look at this. It affects every organ system, okay? It's been linked to decreases in IQ, ADHD, hearing loss. By the way, I just read an article a couple weeks ago in the New York Times. They found a lock of, was it Beethoven's hair? And they analyzed it and it came back with high lead. Now, everybody, the story is he died of syphilis. Now, and he suffered from hearing loss. And now the thinking is maybe he died of lead exposure that led to a variety of sort of breakdowns in these different organ systems. But it is everywhere. It accumulates in the bones because lead is a bully. Your bones are made of calcium phosphate, and lead will get in and it'll knock off the calcium and it will replace the calcium and bind with the phosphate. And people who have been chronically exposed to lead, if they have an X-ray, particularly of their femur bones, you will see this gray line on the X-ray, and those are called lead lines. Now, the issue with that is particularly serious for women when they go through menopause, because what can happen then is the lead can actually leave the bone and go back out into the bloodstream. There's also a problem with people who have been shot with lead bullets, lead casing. There's a case of a gentleman who had been shot. They didn't remove the bullet, and he slowly developed all kinds of neurological issues because lead is a neurotoxin, because this lead bullet had been in his body for decades. About 2012, the Chicago Tribune environmental writer Michael Hawthorne had a series called Poverty's Poison. You can Google it. And it focused primarily on children who had been exposed to lead in the home, and sometimes these were in the CHA high rises. And so I've got some screenshots of the front page here. The woman and her kids on the lower left is a particularly sad case. I think all of her kids have contracted blood lead poisoning. I can't remember, but a number of them have. And she was in a CHA program, and she said, you know, I've got to get out of this. And for reasons I can't remember, the CHA would not give her a voucher. Well, she ended up working, I think, with the Northwestern Law School and was able to move out and get into a place that was lead-free. What's missing from this article is any mention of lead in soil. It's all about paint. It's all about lead and water, but nothing in the soil. And the shot on the lower right, they actually had a slider bar. You could look at the ward that you live in, and they actually would show you the percentage of kids that had blood lead levels. And as you can imagine, the red colors were the highest. So you could move the slider bar over time, I think up to about 2013. And they actually had it broken out by census tract. I'm trying to get this data, but I have been unlucky so far. But again, look at the pattern here. This is from 1996. Remember back to, you know, the pattern of the percentage of kids with elevated blood lead levels. Look at the neighborhoods where this problem is the most pernicious. So we have a soil lead gap, and people don't seem to want to talk about lead in soil in the city, including my former alderman. So how did this project called the What's in Your Soil project get started? Well, it really began, and I didn't use that name then. In 2011, I was part of a NSF, National Science Foundation funded program at DePaul called CIRRUS, CIRRUS, and that stood for Chicago Land Initiative for Recruitment and Retention of Undergraduates in Science. And the PIs were Dr. Chris Gady and Dr. Jesus Pondo in physics, and Emeritus Professor Lynn Narasimhan, who ran our STEM center and was in the math department. I was a faculty mentor in the summer for 3 years, and this was the summer of 2011. We're down at an urban garden down in Fuller Park, and we're taking soil samples, and we analyze them for a lot of different things, including lead. Later on, in about 2013, my DePaul colleague in environmental science and studies, Christy Klimas, and I received a $15,000 grant from US EPA as part of their People, Prosperity, and the Planet program, or P3. And this was a competition for students. So we wrangled up some students from environmental science. We had one from geography, I think maybe public policy. And they had to develop a project that they could share at the national competition in Washington, D.C. And they decided they wanted to put together a soil test kit. So our partner on this was the Gary Comer Youth Center down in the Greater Grand Crossing neighborhood. And you can see we're collecting soil samples from a vacant lot that is owned by Comer. And we did turn up some fairly high lead. One corner of this lot had really, really high lead. And we found out later on that this lot had been used as a dumping ground, and that corner was used to dump lead acid batteries. And the lead from the batteries had leached out and had gotten in the soil. So they're doing field work. You see at the lower right, they did a lot of lab work as well. So in 2016, I launched the What's in Your Soil project. And I want to say that I have been so fortunate and grateful and blessed to work with so many wonderful undergraduate students at DePaul, not only in the Department of Environmental Science and Studies, but in other departments as well. Students who are interested in this project and were willing to volunteer their time. So everything I say thank you to these students. I could not have done this without them. This was collaborative, okay? They brought to the table some really great ideas, and hopefully they got a lot out of the project. Well, one of the things I learned, and I'm wearing the t-shirt, is the power of providing a free t-shirt to attract people. So the logo, the What's in Your Soil logo, was designed by a student, and on the back it says, "Don't be a dirt bag, protect our soil resources." Okay. So the objectives of What's in Your Soil were to characterize and map patterns of various what we call soil health indicators. So let's go back to human health. You go for a physical, and what do? Okay, well, they measure your height, they measure your weight, they take your blood pressure, they measure your pulse. They take the little hammer thing and they hit you on the knees, to test your reflexes. You may give a blood test. If you get to be a certain age, they do a lot more poking and prodding. Okay, so those are soil or human health indicators, or a small suite of human health indicators. Well, we were measuring a small suite of soil health indicators. The idea here was to provide some free soil testing for Chicago homeowners. We worked with community gardens. But really, my goal here was to give these students an authentic research experience in the field and lab. So I teach a course called Environmental Soil Science. It's a project-based course, pretty intense. If you look at the lower left, these are 3 students from that class many years ago, taking samples from a residential property right up on Seminary and Wrightwood. In the center is one of our students collecting from a parkway. I think this was down in Pilsen. And on the right, in 2018, we did a study along the entire length of Western Avenue, starting at Howard Street, and I live in the Rogers Park neighborhood, all the way down to the very end, 26 miles. We sampled soils from the parkways on both sides of Western Avenue every 1 mile, just to see what the trend was. So how did we recruit? Well, this was a little bit of a challenge. A lot of it was word of mouth. I say bribing, the students would bribe friends and relatives to provide a sample. I had a student said, "I'm going to post flyers in my favorite pubs and coffee shops." We reached out to community organizations. I don't know, I think probably we've analyzed over 700, individual soil samples. A student created this flyer, which we sent out. We actually did a blind mailing of over 1,000 and among different community areas. And I think we got 5 responses. So it was a challenge to get people to, submit a sample. Nonetheless, we ended up with quite a few samples to analyze, and then the pandemic hit. So our original design was residential properties. We went to community gardens. We went down to Little Village. We did gardens operated by the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, Just Roots up in Rogers Park. We went out to schools, but I realized that this was getting difficult, again, because trying to recruit homeowners to do this, how do you get the word out? So a new design is we're now sampling from census tract, in the parkways. So just some photos again, the top left, if we go to a home and they have small kids, we will invite the kids to come out. We tell them what we're doing. We'll let them help turn the auger here and collect a sample. The students in the middle are sampling from a parkway. The right was a sample, I think, over in Logan Square. And then the bottom tier is just showing you the types of lab procedures that they do. They all look happy. So now we have a new instrument, thanks to a grant that I was a co-investigator on with my colleague in health science, Dr. Julia Lippert. This was a internally funded grant that allowed us to buy some equipment. the gist of this grant program is we are working with 4 Chicago public high schools in mostly underserved communities. And we have, Dr. Lippert is teaching a class sort of that involves mentoring. The college students are going to be going out to these high schools and working with the high school students after school. They might be part of an ecology club or something. And the students, the high school kids, are going to figure out a project, and it could involve soil testing, it could involve water testing, and we even bought an air sampler. So the instrument you see here is called a portable X-ray fluorescent spectrometer, otherwise known as the PXRF. Kind of looks like a police radar gun. That's my current wonderful student, Dre Harris. Dre worked on his senior thesis with me, measuring and mapping soil lead in parkways in the Uptown community. And the picture of the right is actually my right hand and finger, and we're actually analyzing. So this instrument sends a beam of X-rays into a little vial of soil, and it comes back with 3/4 of the periodic table of elements. So we get lead, we get other heavy metals like cadmium, we can get mercury, arsenic, iron, things like that. So this is going to greatly speed up the process compared to the process that we had been using, which was using a lot of really concentrated acids, which kind of made our departmental laboratorian, go gray, because disposing of this gallons and gallons of this really caustic cocktail of acids was really not very fun. So this doesn't require any use of acids. It's a point and shoot. And so we're really been having a good time with that. So what did we deliver to the homeowner? So the top right is a photo of me in my younger days with a homeowner in Lincoln Park. And the students went and sampled from her property. We provided a soil health assessment report. So the students did all of the field work. They did all of the lab work. I created a report template. They filled in the data. We provided some recommendations on how they might improve the health of their soil, and we sent this to the property owner. The picture on the lower right is the young woman in the yellow shorts is a former student, Twyla Neely Strite. Twyla did her project in the Irving Park neighborhood. And unfortunately, we kind of had to shut that down and modify it at the beginning of the pandemic. But this is one of the property owners that Twyla sampled from. So what this is doing is it's giving the students, I think, like I said, an authentic research experience, interacting with the public, and then providing a report. So here's the type of mapping that can be done. You'll see these little dots are the points where we collected samples. These were actually initially collected by those students in that CIRS program, and then we added some more sampling to it. But this is done by what is called Geographic Information Systems technology. It's mapping software that allows you to map spatial patterns. And you can see from the legend, we've got some areas here that are greater than 880 parts per million of lead. Remember, the magic number is 400. And it's not terribly surprising. Here's the Kennedy Expressway. You've got the river. And, down here, they sampled along Kingsbury Street. And if you've ever walked along Kingsbury Street in Cortland, you had the old Finkel steel plant. You had the Sims Metal Management, which has since moved down to the south side. So it's not terribly surprising that we found high lead there, but this is the red line tracks. Okay, here's Fullerton. And actually what we did is we engaged in what I like to call guerrilla soil sampling. We snuck underneath the tracks and collected soil and measured some of it. And some of the soils had really high lead. And I suspect the reason for that is, those tracks in some parts are really, really old, 75 years, 100 years old. And they probably have been slathered with layers of lead paint, which is flecked off. So, you could just see here, there are areas of, the cooler blue, even some of those are still pretty high. And so people always say, well, my goodness, what should I do? I'll get to that in a minute. Well, Dre, he sampled from the census tracts. So the numbers you see here are the census tracts in Uptown, and he sampled from parkways. And, he didn't find really high concentrations of lead. Kind of the normal background for this area is about 15 to 20 parts per million. But you can see some slightly elevated areas over here in census tracts 310, 318. He looked into he looked at vehicle traffic data from the Chicago Department of Transportation to see, are these areas bounded by streets that have a high volume of traffic, in the morning rush and the nighttime rush? And, didn't turn up anything significant. I would suspect, my bet is that the lead that we're seeing here is just legacy lead from leaded gasoline. It's atmospheric fallout. Lead is a heavy metal. It does not move through the soil very quickly. When water is percolating, it's not, and in fact, a lot of that soil, if it's bare soil, will run off and it'll end up going down a storm drain, and then the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District gets to deal with it. Another student graduated last year. Jennifer Garcia lives in the West Elsdon neighborhood, which is, right down the road from Midway Airport. And she sampled soils from parkways in West Elsdon and Garfield Ridge. And Jenny employed what we call a community science or a citizen science approach. She actually recruited, kids from her high school, Muchin College Prep. She worked with a community group called the Southwest Collective. And what she did is each of these little polygons is a census tract. We made up sample bags for each of these census tracts. Okay, so these little kind of Ziploc snack bags, if you will, and we labeled them with, the census tract number. And then Jenny lives across the street from a park. So on a Saturday, I went down and Jenny led a training on how the people were supposed to collect the samples. So they got a trowel, they got the bags, each bag was labeled. So you'll notice that there are 5 points in each census tract. So each of those points was one of those snack bags, and it was labeled census tract number, whatever, sample 1, sample 2 through sample 5. The students brought the samples back to Jenny's house, and she brought them to the lab and analyzed them before we had the PXRF, and created this map. And, you can see that the highest concentrations are around 200 to 400 parts per million. There's really no areas that are certainly in the 600 to 1,000 range, which for Jenny was surprising because this is an environmental justice community. But for whatever reason, these soils that she sampled from just, they have elevated lead. I don't want to diminish the significance of that, but they're not as high as even some of the soil samples that we've collected in Lincoln Park, which have had over 2,000 parts per million. So just because you buy a $2 million home doesn't mean that you're not getting lead to come along with it. So what do? Okay, you don't, I get asked this all the time. What are we going to do if you've got lead in your soil? So let me go through this a little bit and I catch up here. Okay. How do we reduce the health risk? You don't want to locate food gardens next to a busy road or a home built prior to 1940 with a painted wooden exterior. Now, think about it. In 1871, we had the Great Fire. And after that time, the city council basically banned construction, wood frame, balloon construction. So we became a brick city, which isn't to say that we still don't have homes that have, wood exteriors. Okay, there are. And in fact, you can find those down in Pilsen, where I've noticed a lot of them. You just have to be careful. Don't locate your garden if you've got painted wood exterior, okay, and you haven't painted it since 1978. Move it away from the home. In heavily contaminated soils adjacent to residents, you want to plant trees. Folks, keep your soil covered, okay? Keep it covered. Put mulch, put down grass seed, I don't know, roll out turf, do whatever. Keep it covered, because when it dries out and the wind comes, it's going to blow around. certainly you don't want young kids to be playing in contaminated soils. Now, you're going to say, well, what's the contamination? I'll get to that in the next slides. Frequent hand washing. Now, we all went through this in the pandemic, right? That's not a big deal. Rinse outside toys, okay? Rinse indoor toys. Wash hands. You know, some people will go as far as leaving their outdoor shoes in a box at the door to avoid spreading lead contaminated dust. You want to rinse and launder your garden clothing promptly and don't mix it with other clothes. And then mulch your play areas with wood chips or other materials to reduce the dust. Keep the dust to a minimum. Keep it down. This is a no-no. We've all seen this. Now, I can't remember what was going on here, whether it was a dig up by the city. This is not good. And look at that dog. Looks like maybe a collie. That dog, if it's lying down in the soil, is going to have, soil on its fur, and there may be lead attached to that soil particle. I liken it to the lead particle is the caboose and the soil particle is the engine, and they pitch up. You don't want this. At the very least, if you're not going to plant anything right away, at least spray down the soil to keep the dust down. So what do you do if your soil is at a level of 50 to 400 parts per million? So here's the thing. The state of Illinois does not have a prescribed level of total lead in soil for gardening. States like California do. And I think their limit is 80 parts per million. Okay. If your lead is between 50 and 400, you can grow all of your vegetable and fruit crops safely. And that, again, depends on who you ask. Okay. What's going to control the amount of lead in the soil are things like the pH of the soil, the amount of organic matter, phosphorus. Phosphorus will bind up lead into a slowly soluble mineral. Well, we measure phosphorus in soils in our project, and I can tell you Chicago soils are saturated with phosphorus because people are applying, going to Home Depot or Lowe's or a nursery, and they're buying a bag of fertilizer, what is called NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Or if you're in Lincoln Park, you may hire, a lawn care, and they're doing the same thing. And those people are out now. It's walking around today and saw them. You want your soil ideally to be between about 6, pH to be between 6 and 7. Increase organic matter, add compost, manure, grass clippings, preferably that have not been treated with pesticides or fertilizer. Really, the top 8 inches should be at least 1/3 organic matter by volume. And you can add phosphorus to the soil if you've had your soil tested. If you're living in the city, you probably don't have a phosphorus deficiency problem. Fruits listed here are going to be less likely to contain lead compared to the leafy vegetables and roots. The underside of your leafy vegetables has a texture like Velcro. So soil particles will cling to that, okay? So if you're growing your Swiss chard, you want to bring it in and you want to wash that leaf thoroughly, the top and the underside. Carrots can take up lead and store it, in the outer skin, what we call the epidermis. So peel those and you'll probably be okay. Okay. So you want to wash all veggies and peel the root crops before they're cooked and eaten. Well, what do you do if your lead is over 400? Well, according to the folks at Kansas State University and some others, you can grow your fruiting crops, but do not grow leafy greens or root crops in the native soil. Native soil is the foot underneath, or the soil beneath your feet. Grow it in raised beds, okay? Or you may want to take, just grow it in raised beds and add compost to at least 8 inches. So, I wish I could, these are just ballpark suggestions for you to use as you're contemplating, you're probably going to start getting your lawns and your gardens prepared. And mulched and whatnot now. Remember, there's no safe level of lead, but I want to point out one thing. I have mentioned the term total lead, and that is lead that is found in the soil in all forms. Some of that lead can be tied up in a mineral. So not all of that lead, if you ingest soil, not all of that lead is going to necessarily dissolve in your stomach acid and move across your stomach and get into your bloodstream. So there's another type of lead that we can measure, and we've done it in my lab, and it's called bioaccessible lead. It's the fraction of the total lead that you have ingested, if you're into eating dirt. It's the fraction of that that actually will dissolve in your stomach acid, and then a fraction of that will actually move across your stomach lining and get into your bloodstream. So we measure bioaccessible lead. I don't measure the next step, which is bioavailable lead. The problem is the EPA does not really have a threshold for bioaccessible lead. So you could have 1,000 parts per million of total lead, and you might have 2% bioaccessible lead. That's the bad lead, but we aren't there yet. So all we can do is make some general recommendations based on total lead. So I'll finish up talking about something that is central to my research, and that's the mission of DePaul. And that's very important to me. And it's very important, I make sure that it's important to the students who work with me because we talk about it. I like to say I'm serving society through soil science. I love the alliteration. The top two photos are down at the June Carter Hill Community Garden in the Englewood neighborhood. This was a summer gardening program for kids, kind of an anti-violence program. I mentioned we go to schools. You'll see me and some of my students with our What's in Your Soil t-shirts on. We let the kids collect soil from their school garden and the grounds, showed them how to use some of the field equipment. You'll see a kid who's holding called a double ring infiltrometer. It allows us to measure the rate at which soil moves into, or water moves into the soil. This is my student, Maggie Mullen. We actually made a presentation down at the Peggy Notabart Nature Museum many, many years ago. And the kids on the far right are from the Green Teens program at the Gary Comer Youth Center. We, before the pandemic, would invite the Green Teens to come and basically get their hands all soily and teach them about lead. So a big part of what I do is soil science education, lead health education. I'm a member of the Soil Science Society of America. That's my professional society. I'm on the K through 12 Soil Education Committee, where we are committed to educating kids about soils, because the fact is, when you look at the next generation science standards, which any teacher will know about, there's very little in those about soil. And I think that's a shame, but I don't make the standards. So I've worked with a lot of schools in CPS. I've had students from high school kids from Walter Payton College Prep, Guerin College Prep, who have worked in my lab. I'm hoping to get some students from DePaul College Prep, perhaps working with me this summer to give them hopefully a valuable experience, but also just teaching them to go back out and kind of spread the gospel of soils, which, you know, look, soils don't rate up with climate change, but they are a significant component of how we are going to mitigate climate change. And all of us need to understand a lot better soil and what it does for us and how it can help mitigate many of our most pressing environmental justice problems. So if you are interested in participating in the What's in Your Soil program, you can I'm not giving you a phone number because I can't remember my voicemail login anymore. So I don't even answer my office phone. Just send me an email. You can leave a voicemail and I can activate it, access it through my email. Send me an email. If you're interested in having some soil analyzed, I will send you the instructions. And I thank you so much for your time and attention. I was really looking forward to being able to address our alumni and other guests. So with that, Jasmine, I am done and will be happy to entertain questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Montgomery. We really appreciated all that information, as well as your wealth of knowledge, passion, and expertise in soil. I definitely did not realize how I feel like incorporated soil is in our daily lives, as well as lead. So we can jump right into our Q&A portion. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. One of our questions is, was there any benefit of using lead in earlier construction?
Well, yeah, I mean, Chicago was the last city to outlaw, if that's the word, lead pipes because of the powerful plumbers union. Lead is a very soft and malleable metal. So for plumbing, it was back in the day, an ideal material to use. Steel pipes are more difficult to deal with. Lead you can bend and, conform. So yeah. And even before modern times, even in historic times, lead has been used for a lot of different things, lead implements, lead goblets, as I mentioned. So lead has been around for millennia.
And then the next question is, what are symptoms of lead poisoning or increased lead exposure that I should look out for?
Well, I'm not a neuroscientist, but the symptoms can be symptoms that might be related to ADHD, particularly hyperactivity. I have read, sluggishness in kids, and that could be anything. Stomach pains. Apparently, that's what got Beethoven is, these massive pains. I don't want to, project myself as a medical doctor. What I would say is if parents notice some of these symptoms, contact your child's pediatrician and, say, can I have a lead test done? And in fact, I gave a talk 2 weeks ago at the historic Pullman Garden Society on the far south side, and there was a gentleman who was 81 who came up to me and he had tremors, and he said, I used to be a rehabber. I rehabbed a lot of the homes on the Pullman historic site, and I know they had lead paint, and I'm wondering if I have lead poisoning. I said, well, I'm not a medical doctor. He said, I'm going to my doctor for a physical. I'm going to demand that they do a lead test. Because tremors is another, apparently can be, but that can be a number of different things. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Montgomery, for leading this webinar. I really wish we could get to some of the other questions. Unfortunately, we reached that 7 p.m. end time. But again, thank you so much for your wealth of knowledge, as well as your stories, as well as your project with our undergraduate students. I'm wishing everybody a wonderful rest of the evening. Enjoy that warm, sunny weather. And then also don't forget to send in your soil samples to Dr. Montgomery and his students to get those lead levels tested. And
if they have any questions, they have my email. They can send me their questions. I'm sorry I ran over a little bit. No worries. It's wonderful to hear about your passion. As like I said as well, the expertise that you have on the subject. But yeah, okay, so I'll be ending the webinar for everybody. Again, wishing everyone a wonderful rest of the evening and hopeful to see you guys at our other webinars in the weeks ahead.